Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 314 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I am delighted to catch up with Nadine Pittam, who is an accredited and experienced counsellor, having completed a postgraduate diploma in counselling and psychotherapy from a BACP accredited course at the University of Salford. Today, Nadine is going to talk about how the use of language can develop and strengthen the therapeutic relationship. So with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
A very warm welcome to episode 314, that's 314 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both myself, Ken Kelly, and Rory Oakes are delighted that you've joined us for this episode, where we're going to be having 3 stops on the journey, starting off with ethical, sustainable practice, where we reach I guess the conclusion, Rory, of our trauma focus that we've had recently. We're going to be speaking about understanding trauma and the diverse perspectives of trauma. How might that arise and how might we identify it to better understand our clients? We then go into practice matters, as Rory has already introduced. We have Nadine Pittam, who is going to be speaking about how to use language that can develop and strengthen that therapeutic relationship. And then we go into our student services, recognizing you, the students, on your formal journey to become a counselor, a psychotherapist. And we're going to be speaking about your research project today. And we're going to be answering the question, what should I research? It's an interesting one that I think you'll enjoy it. And if you are a qualified practitioner, stay tuned for that one, because there's some interesting stuff there, because we're always doing CPD. We're always really researching and developing our practice. So there'll be something for you there too. But starting off, Rory, ethical, sustainable practice. We've been speaking a lot about trauma because it is an important topic. But I guess we do have to understand that trauma will show itself differently in different people because of different reasons. There is a diversity within trauma.
Yes, I mean, within all our practice, we have to recognise diversity, that people are different, and that can be the many kinds of difference that people have. But when someone has suffered trauma because of who they are, then that can lead to some complexities that we need to give real attention to, and I think honour. So, if someone experiences trauma because of the colour of their skin, and there's going to be a lot of therapists listening to this who may be working with populations who are asylum seekers, who will hear stories of trauma just because of who someone is, or the colour of the skin, or maybe their religion, or maybe their affiliations. And that then expands to people who've experienced trauma because of their sexuality or their gender selection, if you like. And we have to be thoughtful of that. We have to realise that that's a perspective that we need to keep in our minds, because it's almost certainly going to be a perspective that the client's going to bring up. And that would look like the client saying, why would someone do this to me just because of how I look or the colour of my skin or my sexuality? A few years ago, there was a very prominent case of two lesbian women who were on the top deck of a bus, and they were attacked and suffered physical violence because of who they were. And they were picked on because they were gay. They were gay women. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. There's the trauma, and then there's also the fact that the trauma was delivered because of who you are. And it's sometimes known as, there's different ways of expressing it. Sometimes it's called dual burden. So it's the burden of having trauma, but the burden of having trauma just because of who you are. And that can lead to something called minority stress, where minority groups may experience stress at a different level than people who are not in a minority group. So diverse perspectives and definitions of trauma, something that every trauma-informed practitioner needs to have in the forefront of their mind when working with any client, because you never know what's going to emerge within the arc of therapy.
Thank you, Rory. You mentioned dual burden then. I think that's really, really worth just focusing on for a moment. So, when we look at the definition of trauma, and I'm reading it here from the handout that we're going to be sharing, and of course the page, and this is the American Psychological Association. Of course, there's many different definitions, and it defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. That's what it kind of starts off. There's a little bit more to that definition, but I'm going to leave it over there. So when that event is external to self, and that might be a car accident or something like that, that is a certain kind of trauma. But as you've said, Rory, when it is about who you are and your very core of your being, the trauma is kind of woven into that from, I guess, external abuse of some kind. It does create that dual burden, and it needs to be looked at differently and recognized differently. And I guess you've touched on many different areas of how that might show itself, but there is some similarities in it. There will usually be harassment, discrimination, hostility, and a rejection of the otherness or the individuality of that person. And that is difficult, because so often we look at ourselves and say, is this my fault? What is my part in this? And there's a lot to pick through, and that trauma can run very deep and be very troubling, I guess, and present within your therapy room. And then, of course, trauma can result come about as a result of relationships, and that may be family relationships, or it may be romantic or partner relationships, it may be a marriage, and what happens within that relationship. And I guess that's another area or a different lens through which we might see the trauma, and it's a different lens through which the client will see themselves and their part in that trauma.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And you mentioned within the family. Well, I think that is something that sometimes can be missed, and I think the aspect that can be missed is, if you've got someone who is a survivor of spousal abuse. I'm trying not to use the word victim. I think survivor is a more useful phrase in terms of therapy. Then they may have experienced trauma because of who they are. And I think it's probably natural maybe to think of women who've experienced trauma. And certainly in my practice, I've met many women who've experienced trauma because they're women and their partners have abused them because they're women. But also, we have to acknowledge that there are men who suffer the same thing. So I think it comes down to what you said, Ken, otherness, where somebody is abused because they're different. And that difference can be many, many things. It could even be someone who's got special educational needs. And what happens is they're picked on because they're different. So an autistic child may be picked on because they're different. So it's not the usual suspects, if I can use that phrase, of sexuality, gender, race. It's otherness. It's being and experiencing trauma because you are different to the group of people who are perpetrating that trauma.
Yeah, beautifully said, Rory. Really beautifully packaged there. Bessel van der Kolk, we speak about his work a lot. He's written some defining work on trauma, and he describes being traumatized as a state where individuals organize their lives as if the trauma was still occurring, post that trauma. And, you speak about otherness. I see otherness in myself. I'm very, very open that I am neurodivergent. I'm autistic. I'm diagnosed autistic in my 50s. And when I look back on my life, I realize the trauma and the responses to that trauma that I enact today from being a child, feeling that I was outside the group, feeling that all the other children had it together and I just didn't really understand how it was, having very few friends, being bullied, having names being called to myself. And what is really interesting, Rory, is I went on to live my life, and I've of course developed, I guess, ways of dealing with life as a result of that trauma. Throughout the whole of my study to become a counsellor, at no stage did I recognize that trauma. It was so hidden from myself. It was, if we were talking about the self-development exercise where we kind of try and bring everything into clarity, it was unseen to self and maybe unseen to others. And it just became part of how I would show up and act or interact within a setting. And studying trauma has made me kind of realize and look at my life differently and question how I show up now. If I'm in a group of people, if I go to a networking event, I'm still feeling like that little 9-10-year-old boy of being a little bit shy to walk up to people because they might reject me, and it's acting from that traumatized young person. And I think that is what is so interesting for me, is how we can study and we can learn about the theory and we can do the self-development, but trauma is tricky. It can hide itself in the shadows, I guess.
Yeah, I think it can. And I think that we're now at a point where we're realizing that it's not trauma with the big T. So when I say trauma with the big T, when you talk, certainly to lay people who are probably not in our field, they would say things like war. They would say things like serious industrial accidents, car crashes, witnessing horrific events, and no one would deny that they are traumatic. However, I think that now we're beginning to acknowledge, and rightfully so, there can be small events in life that aren't connected with wars or natural disasters, which set our brain, certainly the middle part of our brain, which is where our fire alarm system is, and we've talked about that on the podcast before, can set our brains to be hypersensitive to situations. And it's really interesting because I live in a very small town. We both live in the middle of nowhere, I think it's fair to say, Ken. And
Yes.
I'm probably for a very good reason thinking about it. But I went into my local town, which is Manchester, the other day, and I noticed just how on high alert I was. I've never been a soldier. I've never fought in a war, thankfully. But I did find myself being hyper vigilant as I stepped off the train and saw literally hundreds of people at the train station. And I found myself, using my phone, but stood in a corner with my back to the wall, using the phone, which on the face of it feels a little bit ludicrous. But then I thought to myself, well, it is a place of safety. At least I can see what's coming. And throughout my trip in Manchester, I have to say that my amygdala was firing off. And when I got back on the train, I was kind of speaking to my wife about it. And I said, this is partly because of my experiences as a younger man in Manchester, which was a very different place when I grew up, I have to say. The 70s was a very violent time anyway, I think. But it never leaves you. You can rationalise it, and you can say, "Oh, Rory," I would say to myself, "Oh, Rory, you're being very, very silly here." But actually, the Vessel Brandercolt's kind of key phrase, if you like, "the body keeps the score," is still very, very true. And if you then amplify that, because we are talking about minorities, if you amplify that for someone who may have a different skin color, sexuality, gender preference, you can have people that find themselves in very innocuous situations, finding themselves really feeling threatened. And as therapists, we have to be aware of that. And sometimes I think as therapists, we have to give it a name. We may have to say to clients, feels like that wasn't a very safe place, and acknowledge it.
100%. As you were relating your story, your trip to Manchester, I was just looking again over that definition. Being traumatized, a state where the individual organizes their lives as if the trauma was still occurring, and you find yourself there with your amygdala firing off in what I guess is just a regular situation, but that is how it is for you, and that is how that plays out, and it's that recognition of recognizing that trauma is not always the industrial accident, the big car crash, that it is more nuanced than that. And I guess on the final remarks, understanding trauma through these varied lenses, it broadens the scope of what trauma encompasses, but it also aids in the development of us as therapists for more effective therapeutic intervention. So by exploring and acknowledging the different definitions of trauma, we can better support our clients. And that's all this is about, isn't it? It's all that it's about. Now, there's an incredible article that has been written on this topic with a handout. And to get the link to that, just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, make your way to episode 314. That's 314. It's this episode. And right there on that page, you can get the link to a really in-depth article, which is beautifully referenced at the bottom there, so you can see deeper reading if you wish to, and plus there is a handout that is really worth just having on hand and looking at. And of course, if you are a qualified practitioner, so you finished your studies and you want to do some training in trauma-informed practice, then please do go and have a look at our training course. It's counsellingtutor.com, and you'll find all the information there. Great topic. Thank you for bringing it. That kind of brings us to the end of our focus on trauma. And going forward next week, Rory, we're into neurodivergence, autism, and looking at what that journey looks like for practitioners. So I'm really looking forward to that chat. And I guess that brings us to the end of ethical, sustainable practice. And we move out of that into our CPD section, which we call Practice Matters, where, Rory, you reached out and had the discussion about how the use of language can develop and strengthen the therapeutic relationship. Tell us more.
Well, yes, indeed. I had a wonderful conversation with Nadine Pittham, who is a psychotherapist who has a real passion for the use of language and how that engages in the therapeutic relationship. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Language and the way we communicate is absolutely the heart of the therapeutic encounter, which is why I'm delighted today to be speaking with Nadine Pittham, and a therapist who is really interested in how language is used, and also how that creates this space, this almost safe space, where the relationship can grow and thrive. So, Nadine Pittam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, language, we can take it quite for granted, I think, because we all use language. It may not be English, but most people use language or some form of communication. But why is the use of language so important in the therapeutic relationship?
For me, it does more than convey fact. So when we first meet a client, I think what happens is the world doesn't exist between us when we meet. When we first let them in the room, there is no world that exists between us. But then through language, slowly over time, we build a world together. And that world becomes textured. It becomes a place where the person sitting opposite us feels safe, they feel warm, they feel respected. And then if we can perhaps imagine it like fiber optic cables. So each time the person opposite us says something painful or talks about their struggle or reveals a vulnerability, if we imagine it being like our acknowledgement of that, our empathy, our recognition of their pain, sends a kind of fiber optic cable between us and them. And each time we do that, we build a thicker and thicker kind of tube, a conduit really, between the two of us. And all the while we're creating a textured world around us with the language. So language is important, I think, from that first instance. But it's not necessarily the thing that heals, at least in my therapy and in some significant key moments with clients that I've seen as well, that it's actually when we've got that thick conduit of connection between us and we've created that world of safety, it is then from within that the client can then receive our empathy. It's through this tube of empathy that we've built up through these tiny fiber optic cables that creates then a tube of light. It's then the empathy can travel through that. But I don't think it can be felt sort of en masse in the same way until we've built that world. Does any of that make sense?
It does. It's almost, I was painting in my mind then, throwing out lifelines to people in the form of language, like two ships that are near each other, and you're trying to connect to it, and you throw a cable out, and they pull that, and that would be okay, and then you throw another one, and that would be stronger, and another one, and another one, and another one, until it was so strong that both the ships could sail parallel along, and one of the ships could do that quite safely. So how does that conversation start? How does that initial building and developing of this cable start in the therapeutic relationship? I guess is my first question.
I guess it starts before we even encounter them. It starts through the email communication, if indeed we have that. Certainly I do with the people who inquire to see me. And I remember looking for a therapist myself, and the email communication that comes back, I think, is really important. There was somebody who insisted on it being a Zoom call, and they wouldn't have a phone call with me. And immediately I felt a little bit of resistance to that. So I'm not saying I didn't then speak to them and see how it all felt, but I definitely noticed the resistance. And for our clients, they'll be feeling things too, won't they? They'll be seeing how we communicate with them and how we handle them in those early stages, because they're incredibly vulnerable at that point. That's, for some, perhaps the first time they've ever reached out to somebody. So I think it starts in those early email communications. But certainly then in the phone call, if we have a phone call, I remember having a conversation with a guy who started the call with me at the point he'd already decided to go with somebody else. And during the course of the phone call, I said to him, sort of about 5 or 10 minutes in, I said, I'm feeling some resistance, like, you're not understanding me. We're not making a connection here. And he said, I've just had this decision that I'm going to go with somebody else. And we talked about why he'd chosen to go with that person. And I just offered one thing that sounded counter. It stood counter to what he'd already heard from the phone call with this other therapist. And it pulled him up short. And it was basically an opinion that I had about therapy bringing forward pain, that therapy actually, it's not about dealing with symptoms, it's actually about bringing forth the pain and with tenderness, exploring that. And there was something about the way that I said that in that instant, I could feel it. He felt it. We talked about it in sessions since, that flipped him. And he said, right in that moment, I want to come see you. There was something that I'd said, and I still don't really know what it was exactly about that sentence that grabbed him. But we did talk about it. I didn't really kind of get a sense of clarity from it. then when people come in the room, I do think it's how we handle that vulnerability. So how do we handle their access to the room? Even that, are you sure that you know the way? I'll leave my phone on in case you get lost. All this kind of, I am here, I'm right here, and I'm trying to understand your experience at this point. And so we're using language for that, aren't we? But actually what we're doing is we're conveying a sense that we are aware of their position.
Yes.
And then I think once they come in the room, then it is the work of language, isn't it? It is then the work of how much space and time we give them, what we say, what we choose not to say, how we filter things through the theory in our head, perhaps quite quietly, and then find a different and more tender way of conveying that to the person. Because I think this is the key, isn't it? I think it's one of the conditions, one of Roger's conditions anyway, that gets forgotten frequently, which is that empathy needs to be received by the client. So it's all well and good us kind of saying, oh, that must be hard. But if it's just pinging off the other person and we aren't noticing that it's pinging off the other person, then we're not helping. We're not making progress. We're not firing those lifelines across to the other ship.
Yes, and that's interesting. As a lifelong kind of student or scholar of Roger's, I always think that particular necessary and sufficient condition is an interesting one, that at some level the empathy of the therapist must be received by the client. And I think people sometimes forget that some of those conditions, and it doesn't matter if you're a TA therapist or a Freudian therapist or a person-centered therapist, but, the kind of meeting of client and therapist is that you have to kind of make an assessment. Are you when you're throwing that cable out, is it being picked up? And if it isn't, what position do you go to next? What cable do you choose to throw in terms of the language? Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense, and it sets something else up in my head, because if we're just on one ship firing kind of willy-nilly,
yes,
they're not going to feel like like, you don't know where I am. You're getting this all wrong, and so they're going to feel more and more alienated. Whereas if we say, I just tried a lifeline, that I feel like that went awry. Can you tell me your position a bit more? Can you help me understand? Because I clearly got that wrong. And then it's like the mistake. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, but it changes the quality and the texture of the mistake if we're prepared to say, I feel like I missed you there, because it acknowledges their position in being missed, doesn't it? And so that is empathic in itself.
Yes. And if you think about it for very practical terms, if you were on a boat and someone threw a lifeline and it shot past the bow and ended up in the sea, and then they just continued throwing them, you would literally feel missed, and you'd wonder about the competence and the commitment of the person throwing the line. and I think the same applies to therapy. And what I really like is the ability that, and you kind of outlined it very clearly there, of actually admitting that and bringing that into the room. I think I might have missed you there.
Yeah, certainly in my experience, they've been really powerful moments. And as a client, when my therapist has said those things to me as well, it feels like, we're working on something together here. They're not, what is it? Somebody brilliant once said, I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to get things right.
Yes.
And there's a massive difference there. And if we stand with ego and say, I understand you, this is obviously what you mean, then I think that's alienating. Whereas if we say, oh, what about that? Have I got it? Tell me where I'm wrong. That's one of my favorite little phrases, actually. I do use that quite a lot. Tell me where I'm wrong. And then it invites a kind of criticism. It invites a tweaking and an attention to nuance.
Yeah. It's like playing two musical instruments, isn't it? I mean, not that I'm musically inclined in any way, but, for those friends who are musicians, sometimes they'll play a duff note and the other person will go, I can't pick up on that. And eventually you intertwine and move, and it becomes almost like a dance to some extent. And I guess it's really important, because clients will have had a lot of people in the past just giving them platitudes or being dismissed. Sometimes to be heard could be quite a novel, new, and I don't know what your thoughts are, but quite a scary thing for some people to actually be heard.
Absolutely. I think that a lot of people experience the other person who could be listening as actually trying to fix them, and which actually that conveys you're not okay as you are. this state that you are in is not okay because it needs fixing, and everybody should be running around and trying to help you in this place, rather than showing curiosity and understanding the depth of it. The number of times a client has walked out after session 1 and there's a part of me that's gone, I know how this is going to go. And then by session 2, obviously it hasn't. The whole thing has blown up around me, and so it should. We should not expect to know somebody after, 50 minutes. That people are much more complex. And I think that's the beauty of it for me. I think that's where the magic comes, in that nuance and in that texture. And in the quality of the world around us. And I think for me, that's where metaphor comes in, because it's so expansive and it can change over time. There are people I've worked with where we started a metaphor in maybe session 1, 2, 3. There's one particular person I'm thinking of. We use a metaphor of a swamp, because she talked about feeling like there was this swamp at the back of her life that she didn't want anybody to see. She certainly didn't want to look at it. And it just must be over there. It's stinky. It's going to swallow me whole. It's got some horrible stuff lurking in it and I can't see to the bottom. So this swamp kind of started, and sessions or so. And I can count on one hand the number of times the swamp metaphor has not come up in sessions. And now it's evolved to such a state where she'll be talking about getting in the swamp and inviting friends in and having a ladder on the side of the swamp. And sometimes she says, I was walking down the street yesterday, I felt like I had a bit of swamp on me all the time. And the whole metaphor becomes utterly expansive. And I think that's about creating a world. I don't talk about the swamp metaphor with anybody else apart from that person. It's something that we create. It's a world we create together.
Yeah, and we talk about idiosyncratic empathy. In other words, that bespoke, tailored approach to clients that really fits them. And a metaphor fits really into that. Do you think, talking about metaphor, do you think that it's really useful for some people to give their difficulties an external name in language? So you've talked about, the swamp. Is it in your experience something that clients do as a form of safety to be able to talk about an issue in a non-issue way, if you like? I won't speak about my issues, but I'll call it the swamp.
I think so, but I don't think everybody does. I think some people have a natural kind of tendency towards using metaphor and building them, and there are other people for whom it's not particularly effective, as in they don't bring it very much. And so I might offer one, but again, it might be a lifeline that just ends up in the water, the other side of the ship. Something else I wanted to respond to in what you said about metaphor. Oh, yeah. I read somewhere, and I'm so sorry, I can't remember where it was, that actually talking in metaphor enables the client to kind of externalize it. So it's not lighting up the same part of their brain because they're talking about an image, not necessarily a visual image, but they're talking about an image, and somehow that it connects to a different part. It's not igniting that trauma in exactly the same way. And also, arguably, it's easier for them to remember. The metaphor is something that endures between sessions for people in a way that if I say, oh, it sounds like blah, 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 and lay out some kind of utterly genius, in my opinion, analytical postulation,
yes.
And they go away and they're not interested in that at all. But when I said, oh, it feels like you are, that the swamp actually feels a little clearer now, that you're actually getting some soap bubbles in there, then that somehow seems to endure between the sessions. And I don't understand why. I just can see that happening over and over again. Yeah,
I guess in my experience, some clients will use it as a form of safety. I think you're absolutely right. The idea that that they could somehow externalize the issue by talking in metaphor. But also it gives us a common currency as therapists and clients to talk about it. And I don't know what your experience has been, but sometimes you don't actually know initially in the initial stages of therapy what the issue is. The metaphor is used, and that can be as much of a mystery to us. So I want to talk about the swamp, but you've no idea what the swamp is.
Absolutely. So you're saying it evolves. You're going into a dark room. You've got a torch and you're playing the light of the torch over the objects in the room so we can see fractions, glimmers of different things in the room, but we can't see the whole picture. And so we have to trust, is it Gendlin? That we have to trust that those bits will be revealed as we as we explore with them. And we don't try and nail it. We're not trying to map the room as quickly as possible. That's not the point. But perhaps to try and use the phrase like work alongside. And that's what we're trying to do all the time, isn't it? To work with them a little bit more at their pace. We're not trying to drag them into the room and go, I know where the light switch is.
Yes.
And that it's, a much more collegiate exploration of a space that neither of us know much about. I agree.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes in those dialogues, there's an emergence of what the issue is. You know, so I've certainly worked with a lot of clients who've been traumatized. And, you know, as part of building that relationship, we talk around what it is. We don't talk about exactly what it is until the relationship and that conduit has become stronger.
Yeah, there was a tutor when I was training who talked about that, like the rim of a volcano, and that the lava and the magma is it's life-threatening. You know, it feels like for people, it can feel like our emotions are going to kill us. It can feel like they are life and death. And so, we walk around the rim of the volcano and we're kind of smelling what it's like. We're talking about what the experience is of walking around this. What would it be like if we went down into that pit at the center of the volcano? And so, we're exploring it from a safer vantage point.
What happens when the ropes snap, the conduits snap, when there's a fracture in the therapeutic relationship? Where do you go to make a repatriative position on that?
Oh, God, that's an impossible question to answer because it will depend entirely on what the rupture was. But again, isn't there evidence that the rupture is an integral and important part of the therapeutic relationship, because it is through rupture that we create a stronger bond, isn't it? So I actually don't want a therapist who's perfect, or indeed a supervisor who's perfect. I want a therapist who's prepared to kind of, tussle, negotiate, and say, oh, I did get it wrong there.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it's I certainly don't think it's a bad thing. You said, where do I go? I suppose if I'm being wholly honest, where I go instantly inside me is, I've done it all wrong. Oh my God, I'm so rubbish at this. That's where I go inside. So I have to kind of let that part of me in and pop her on the side and then try and sort of regroup and look a little bit more at their experience of that. Because, it's not about whether I'm succeeding or failing. And I think that language is rife in our culture, isn't it? That we do things right or wrong. There's a black and a white. And the longer I do this job, the more that I realise that is just not the case, and how beautiful it is that it's not the case. There is no right and wrong. There is no black and white.
And within that beauty, I think that there's some modelling there, isn't there? Because if the therapist gets it wrong, it's okay for the client. Clients have been brought up with conditions of worth and interjected values or injunctions for those colleagues in the TA world. To see the therapist be human and get it wrong is sometimes quite a revelation, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's imperfection across the board, isn't it? Warms us to people. We love imperfection in other people. We just don't really like it when it happens inside us. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a very big part of building that therapeutic relationship, and all the evidence supports the fact that the relationship is a big part of the curative factor, not the modality, but the relationship. As we come to the end of our time together, I wonder what kind of takeaway thoughts, for want of a better phrase, you might have for someone listening about building the relation, about building those conduits. What could you say to someone who's listening, who might be thinking, I'm not quite sure I'm doing it right, or what can I do better, or this sounds all very well and good. What would you say to that person?
Gosh, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways we could go. So I was thinking at first about that Yalom quote that therapy is the thing that happens underneath the conversation. Yes. And so to worry less, I suppose, about the individual words that we're choosing, and more to hold on to, if we feel stuck, like we don't know what to say, that's what we need to say. Maybe not in those words, but that trust the feeling that's going on and try and find a way to articulate that feeling with the person sitting opposite you, with their with their soul in front of you. So we're trying to say it delicately. So quite often I'll be in a situation where I can't quite work out what it is I think or feel or what I'm experiencing with the person. And so rather than, obviously my head is going to a binary trying to figure out which of the two things that I'm thinking is, again, sitting with that space and then offering both. So seeing language as something that is muscular, something that is textured. I keep using that word today. I'm aware of that. But it is textured. It is nuanced. Language is not about fact. It's about, at least not in the therapy room. I mean, it is, if we are, an email marketer, perhaps. Yes. Language is a little bit more about the conveyance of information. But for us, it's less so. It's just another tool in our armory. So if we can present confusion, if we can present multiplicity, if we can present the grey at the either side of the black and white, and if we can find a language that does that, for me, I think we're winning. Yeah. At least on one of the many fronts that we have in therapy. We're winning that small battle.
So I paid as much attention to the music behind the words as I used to say. It's the music behind the
beautiful.
Words.
Yeah.
So on that,
the complexity.
So on that hopeful note, Nadine Pittman, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks ever so much, Rory.
Massive thank you to Nadine Pittman. Thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, holding those all-important interviews that bring us, the CPD, a glimpse into somebody else's practice and what they specialize in. Yes, so that is Practice Matters. We now move on from Practice Matters. We recognize you, our students, as we go into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And in Student Services today, an evergreen topic, a question that comes up again and again, and that is, what should I research? So there's going to come a time in your counselling studies where you're called upon to do a little bit of research into a certain topic or area, and we get a lot of questions about this, and we've got maybe something to discuss about that, Rory.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've got a lot to discuss about it, Ken. I think the interesting thing about research is it depends on who you're speaking to. So if someone's doing a diploma, level 4 or level 8 for our friends in Scotland, it'll be a small scale research project. In other words, you may have to research just on a very small scale and present it. But if you're doing degree or masters, and certainly in masters, that is going to be a huge part of the completion of your course. So usually it's a complete year of research, learning how to research and to research. And I think choosing what we research is really important, because if we don't set expectations right at the beginning of the research quest, we may come to the end of it and find ourselves in deep water. So, an example of that would be someone who says, well, I'm going to look at trauma with Polynesian tribes, and they start with that, but it may be that the mechanics of interviewing someone in Polynesia, and I'm just pulling that out of the air, is that they might have to travel over there. So what could start off as a really interesting research project and something that could really add to the canon of information helping clients becomes impossible to do. So I think you have to set your expectations and think about, first of all, first principle, how long have you got from thinking about the project to handing it in at the end of the your training duration, and making sure that what you're researching is viable to do. And I think at level 4 or level 8, if you're in Scotland, it's only going to be a short research project. So again, it's about managing those expectations, but making sure you finish it. I've seen a lot of students who have very, very exciting ideas, but it just doesn't fit into the time they have available.
Yeah, I think that is definitely worth looking at. If you go very niche, and specifically, like you were saying, Rory, at the lower level. So if you're doing a master's degree, well, then you're going to have pretty much the time set aside, and that's going to be your main focus. But of course, if you maybe at a level 4, level 5, you're going to have assignments, you're going to have a lot of other work that needs to be handed in, and your research project is going to be just a small part of that, an important part of it, but a small part of that. And it's there really to prepare you if you do decide to go on, so that you kind of have a basis in the research methodologies, and you've been through that, and you've kind of felt what that feels like. So at those lower levels, going too niche results in there being little information, or difficult to find information, or information that you maybe don't have access to because you don't have access to the research journals that you may have at a higher level. And that causes it to be really hard work, and what can be really exciting in the beginning. And generally the research projects, the tutor may team you up, and you may have a small group, and the group can be so excited about it. It can be really downheartening when you're not able to access the information within the time. And I think you've just covered that beautifully. And I've jumped into our student library. So there's no secret there. Counselling Tutor, we have a library built for students. We've got a lot of free information on counsellingtutor.com, but we do have a paid-for section called the Student Library. And I put in as a search research, because I know you put a massive amount of work into building out the research section in the Student Library. And within there, if you are a member, log in and just do a search for the word research if you're doing a research project. It's got everything from a full research workshop that kind of works you through workshopping your ideas, the importance of research in counselling, your research proposal, which is such an important part. If you're doing research, part of that is going to be a proposal that you put forward to your tutor before you even begin the research, or you may begin a little bit of it, but you're going to say, I'm proposing this research. There's also something that is very valuable in the library, and that's secondary research links. And I know that those are links that, Rory, you took a lot of time to go through, find various topics and I guess authority sites that when you have certain area of interest, you might find it on that list, and be able, and then presenting your research. That's a whole different section again of how you present that. It usually may mean that you're standing up. You might have a PowerPoint. You may be sharing that presentation with your peers. There's the methods that go into the research, and this is all just available in the student library. If you are a member, log in, put in research. It's there for you. If you're not a member, go to counsellingtutor.com and you can find it there on our products page, definitely. But there's just a lot to it, isn't it? It's more than just thinking up a good idea and being excited about it.
Yes. I mean, the first thing is ethical approval. So having an idea, and then can you get it ethically approved? And what ethically approved is that usually your tutor looks at the research and says, is this ethical to conduct? So I'll give you an example of that. Many years ago, I was sat in the faculty I worked at, and a colleague from, I think it was the criminology department, said, our students want to do a research on personality disorders in prison. Do you think we should send questionnaires to the prisoners and ask them, and then we can work out if actually a lot of the prison population has personality disorders? And when I stopped laughing, and she said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, first of all, with research, if you're doing anything with participants, you have to share it with them. I said, so, you could be sticking and this was, I think this was at level 3, which would be level 7 in Scotland, I think, or certificate level in Scotland. And I said, you can't be giving people research saying that they've got personality disorders. You can't do that. I said, and secondly, and never get past the prison warden. And who's going to do the interviews and how they're going to be conducted? Well, we're thinking of sending a questionnaire. And I said, so how's the questionnaire constructed? What questions are you going to ask? You're going to ask, have you got a personality disorder? Yes, no, tick. And after I'd kind of explained it, she said, I don't think this is a very good idea, is it? I said, I think the sentiment might be interesting. And I think there could be merit at some level in understanding the mental health and the emotional health of the prison population. But I don't think this is the right way to do it. And I never heard anything after that, apart from, we waved at each other in the refectory when we were having coffee. So we never heard anything after that. So the first thing is ethical approval. And once you've got ethical approval, then you have to work out the methodology. And are you going to use, there's different forms of methodology, but at a very basic level, there's ideographic and nomeographic, which is you could either go for qualitative research where you're looking at qualitative research, which is where you're going for numbers, or qualitative research where you're going for experience. I think I might have got those the wrong way around.
Quantitative. I always remember
numbers,
this.
Isn't it?
The only way I remember it, Rory, is because quantitative has got quantity. It sounds like that's how I remember it. That's how I remembered it for my assignments.
Yes.
Quantity, the amount of. Yeah, so quantitative and qualitative, where you kind of asking questions about their experience and feelings on that, but quantitative, where it's a definite number and easier measured. And I guess, coming back to selecting a topic, there's so many topics that you may wish to look at, but what might be worthwhile, and I'm speaking again at the lower levels when you're doing a smaller research project, is if you think about where do you want to work as a counsellor, as a psychotherapist, when you graduate, is there a certain area of work you want to go into? It might be children and young people. It may be working with people that are experiencing bereavement. It could be, you might want to work with breath work or trauma grounding or trauma clients presenting with trauma. And if you look at what are your interests for your further development, where do you see your career going, that can be a great way to select a topic. And you may find, yes, oh, wow, this really resonates and I'm interested in this. Or you may look at that and go, wow, okay, maybe I don't want to go down that route right there. What we've done in the counselling student library. So the student library was put together to help academically with the theory and the skills and practice things like note taking and what you'll cover in your formal training. But at Rory's permission, we added in a very specially selected group of CPD lectures that come from our qualified CPD library, which is not open to students. But we've placed them in the student library to give you an idea so that you can kind of have a look at areas where other people specialize and see, is that an interesting area for me? Is that an area I want to kind of go into? So I'm looking at what we've just recently, racial identity. We've got taking risks in therapy, emotions, imposter syndrome, adverse breath work. There's walk and talk therapy, using creative writing in therapy, looking at attachment. So there's even a working in prison counselling, Rory, as you say.
Yeah, there is.
There is even something on that as well. So if you have an interest, it's worth having a look. If you're a member of the student library, log in, look at the CPD section, and maybe you might find a lecture from an expert on the topic that would interest you. And at least then you've got a starting point. And of course, there'll be references there as well that you can follow to research a little deeper. But yeah, this is it, isn't it? Research is important. Why is research important, Rory? What's it there for? Does it really apply to therapy?
Well, it does. It applies to everything. It applies to everything. If we didn't have research, I'd have a bicycle with square wheels, and a very shaky back, I would imagine. And the reason for that is that research is the lifeblood of our profession. It's the living embodiment of what we do. We strive to be more informed, to be better, more replete for our clients. And we do that by asking questions. And the research can be useful for two reasons. One, it's endless curiosity, I think, is brilliant for the intellect, and I think it's particularly brilliant for anybody who's doing any client-facing work, be they doctors or dentists or whatever, or any profession really, building profession. Research is really, really good because we find out more things and we challenge what we believe we know. But also, having a research background, being able to research is very useful for if you get a job, maybe you're working for a charity or an organization, and it may be you have to pitch for funding. And they may, part of that funding pitch, the specification it's sometimes called, may say, show research into why you need the funding. And if you've got a background in research and you can use that, then you're more likely to get funding. And that's the world we live in. That's the world we live in. And I'd like to say a final thing. I remember many years ago, I taught criminology modules, and someone was asking the question. It was a criminology class. Should I research CBT, the effectiveness of CBT? So it wasn't for therapy. CBT is used in offender services. Probation service use CBT, and I said I think that's a fantastic idea. And this person went to the university, put this idea, and the person said, "Well, that's been done to death. That's been done to death." And she came back and said, "Well, professor says that's been done to death." And I said, "Well, that doesn't mean you don't stop asking the questions."
Yes.
I said, it probably has been done to death. I said, but you could be the person who finds something that no one else has seen.
Yes.
And that is why we do research. Just because a topic's been covered doesn't mean we can't look at it again and say with fresh eyes. And I think she went away and did a research on C. She was good. I was in access to higher education, so she went on to university. And I seem to remember it coming back to me that she did do a research on CBT. So it's very, very important. And I also think it links into the why. One of the things that drives people in therapy is passion to help people. What is your why? So if you're choosing a subject, what's your why? Why did you come into this work? And if you can find that why, then almost certainly that might be a really good route to take your research down, because that's going to link into your passion. It's going to link into your reason for doing the work. And that's going to make your life a lot easier because it's part of who you are.
I like it, Rory. Well, there it is. And we're so grateful you lent us your ears today.
Yes.
This has been episode 314 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
And we started off with ethical, sustainable practice, understanding trauma, and we talked of diverse perspectives, othering, and how dual burden and being traumatized because of prejudice can have a specific effect on an individual. In Practice Matters, we had a wonderful conversation with Nadine Pittam, who talked about the use of language and metaphor in therapy and building that all-important therapeutic relationship. And finally, in student services, we looked at the lifeblood of our profession, research, and tried to answer, or at least spoke to the question, what should I research? And before I sign off, if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast platform, if you could leave us a review, or maybe you could share this podcast with other peers or other people who are interested, so we can share far and wide and share the information that Ken and myself have a conversation about. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.